Hi, welcome to this lesson. This is the Haftarah for the Torah portion, Lecha. So our Haftarah covers Isaiah chapter 40, starting in verse 27, all the way to 41, verse 16. So if you have not already read these verses, go ahead and read them now and then come back to the lesson. So this lesson ended up being a little bit different than what I had originally planned. Let me emphasize what I had planned. So my plan was, like I've done before, to kind of look at the historical context of this Haftarah and then see how it ties in with the Torah portion, Lech Lecha. See how the portion talking about Abraham may have a tie-in here, right? But that's not how this lesson turned out, because I got stuck on one verse and then a whole thing happened. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been reading along and a verse sticks out so much to you that you just can't move past it? Well, that's why I recommend that when you're looking at the Torah portion or the Haftarah, that you always read the entire section through first, and then you can go back to what sticks out. The other thing I learned through this lesson was don't be so quick to stick to the routine and the same thing in your studies that you miss out on something really amazing that God wants to show you. So I'm glad that I went with the flow and this lesson developed, and I hope that you're blessed by it too. Well, I got to tell you, I can't even with this Haftarah. Just it blows me away. You know, for the past couple of lessons, we've been learning how Isaiah speaks God's words of hope into the brokenhearted, the despondent, the abused, the displaced. He's speaking into the lives of those who have lost hope. The very first verse of this Haftarah kind of says it best, all about that lost hope. So that would be Isaiah 40:27. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my rights are overlooked by my Elohim? So Isaiah is speaking, as we know, futuristically to those that are living in exile. And he is he's talking to those after the destruction of Jerusalem, right? Of course, that's future to him. But he's also speaking into every generation of those who have lost hope. Even, and maybe especially, lost hope in God. He speaks to those who, when they look around them, all they see is confirmation that they've been abandoned by God, that God's just not interested in them. Now, it's painful for me to say this, but I do want to say this. This state of being, that God's deserted them, that's what some in Christianity teach. Certainly those who belong to the idea of replacement theology. They believe that after the death of Messiah, God rejected the Jewish people and he chose the Christians to replace them. And the evidence, according to these early anti-Semites in church history, the evidence was the destruction of the temple and the exile of the southern kingdom into Babylon after the exile of the northern kingdom. So I want to point out that it's in this Haftarah that whole argument of replacement theology kind of falls apart. In chapter 41:9, it says of those who can see the destruction of the temple, to those who can see and are experiencing the exile, he says, "You are my servant. I have chosen you and not rejected you." Well, if that's not amazing enough, it's that very next verse that was the one that I got stuck on, but in a good way. And that's Isaiah 41:10. And that says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not look around, for I am your Elohim. I shall fortify you. I shall also help you. I shall uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness." Now, Isaiah's words, as we know, have been and are filled with promise of restoration, hope, encouragement. What I'd like to do in the remainder of this lesson is just highlight some of those words from that Isaiah 41:10 that I just read to you. So the first one that we start off with is, "Do not fear, for I am with you." Now, fear is the Hebrew word yareh. So this would be those places where Israel and you and I feel intense abandonment, shame, guilt. When God tells us, "Do not fear," what we need is a feeling of security, of safety, of belonging, of purpose, of worth, of dignity, right? To know that we're accepted by God, even now, even in the middle of all of our mistakes and our failures. Well, God promises that the terror of those things that we fear, that they won't destroy us, and that He will heal the wounds caused by our fear. He says, "I'm with you." That's the Hebrew phrase, "im makah ani." And literally it means, "with you am I." With you am I. He is with all of His creation, which includes you. So in the Hebrew, the sense is that creation is an extension of the very character of God. It means that everywhere there is creation, God is. Now, one of my favorite Bible teachers, Dr. Skip Moen, says that fear is a result of experienced separation. It's being alone. It's being apart, different, companionless, forsaken, unloved. But, Dr. Moen says, if God is manifest in everything created, then fear is a lie about the immanence of God. God is inherent in His handiwork, right? So there's no part of anything that does not reflect His being. Now, knowing that God is everywhere means that He knows that you sin. He knows what your sin is, even if you don't, even if it's like hidden from you. And if that frightens you, but not like in that awe and reverent kind of fear, remember that God doesn't speak through Isaiah in these verses about the sin of the people, right? What does He speak? He speaks comfort. The opening verse of chapter 40 is Nakamu, Nakamu Ami, which means comfort, take comfort, my people. He's saying you've had enough. You've paid for your sins twice. These are the verses in chapter 40, verse 1. You've been crushed by guilt and remorse, but now know this. I am with you, He says. Okay. Let's go back to chapter 41, that verse 10 that I'm stuck on. It also says, in different versions will say different things, do not anxiously look about you. Do not look around. I love how God's telling us, don't be afraid because the entire creation is under my care, He says. Now let that sink in. Entire creation is under His care. Again, as we mentioned in one of the earlier lessons, that's the beauty of Sabbath, is that we get to stand and affirm that the entire creation is under His care. Is it any wonder that He asks us to repeat Sabbath every 7 days so that we can get this in our minds, right? Because that's how we learn not to be afraid. But then He also takes it to the practical. He says, don't look anxiously about. Don't shift your gaze from one thing to another, worrying about what's going to happen next. Now, we know that fear subsides when we aren't looking over our shoulders anymore, right? When we don't have to scan the room for any threats. We don't have to scan because we can know that God does. When we trust Him, we don't have any need to be anxious about what's going to happen next, either to us or to our loved ones. The anxiety, I like to say, it serves as a check engine light, or maybe a check-in engine light. Check in with God. Ask, am I trusting God in this moment? Or did I forget Him again? It's easy to forget Him in those fearful moments, isn't it? Now, giving up fear is easier said than done. And giving up fear-based behaviors is easier said than done. We know from neuroscience that until we feel safe, we can't access those logical thinking parts of the brain. That's why we get stuck in behaviors that scream self-preservation, even when there's no real threat to us. We have to feel safe. When we're not in our thinking logical brain, then psychological and spiritual growth is stunted. And it's stunted because this growth isn't given any energy when all of our energy and our brain power and our body systems are on full alert to keep us alive because of our fear. So God needs to break through this protective shell of survival behaviors in order to heal our fears and allow us to grow. Worry says, God doesn't care about me. That's a lie. But we do need some assistance in learning to trust. We need some assistance in learning to remember to trust God in all of our moments. And Isaiah tells us that God's got that covered too. Because in that same verse 10, it also says, I will strengthen you. Now, of course, God knows how His people are feeling. He knows that they're crushed, they're despondent, they're hopeless, they're fearful. And it's because of that He decides He's going to do something about it. He does something about it because He can. That's the pure essence of grace. Grace depends on the character of God Himself, not anything about the person that He's bestowing grace upon. And that can be comforting, especially when we're in the midst of, we've blown it. Now, Isaiah, again, as I've said, he's speaking into a distant from him generation. A generation that's like in shock about the destruction by Babylon and the exile. All their prayers and their petitions, it didn't change the outcome. Have you ever prayed for somebody who was ill and they still died? Have you ever prayed for someone who's not walking on the path to come back to the path and they're not yet? Then you know how that feels. Isaiah speaks to a people who now to them it seems that God has left them. And can you imagine the voices of the scoffers at this point? Ha ha, where is your God now? Well, it's into that mess that Isaiah speaks God's words that say, I will strengthen you. And he says this to a people that have nothing to offer. There's that grace again. That word strengthen in Hebrew means to make firm or secure, to feel strong. God tells us that all of our anxieties are unnecessary when He's our God. because he wants us to know it's not our abilities that we rely on in the first place. What? You mean I don't have to do this life alone? No. God will deliver us by his right hand, he says, not by ours. So stop thinking you can handle it all, because God's strength won't be yours until you stop trying to live according to your own rules. Can you see now why this one verse stopped me in my tracks? Yeah, I get it. It's okay to need strengthening. I'm not supposed to do it all on my own. Now, verse 10 also says, I will help you. Help is interesting. It has the same root as that phrase, ezer kenegdo. You might know this as the description of the role of us women, translated horribly by King James, helpmeet. God is the ezer of Israel. Strength from the ezer means help for us. It means assistance. Now that's really key, because assistance requires a joint effort. It's a joint effort between us and God, but it's not an equal effort. God pulls his weight a lot more than we do. You may remember Yeshua's story of the crippled man at the pool of Siloam. He asked him, do you want to be made whole? And it took the response of the man in order for the miracle to occur. So what's the lesson? Nothing happens while we sit and do nothing. That's not faith. When the moment arrives, help requires a response from us. But think about it. It's not so much a response as it is a relationship. God does something, we do something. That's a relationship. And God's promise is that he helps us through the offer of his right hand. Now that makes me think of the phrase, when you're thinking about giving charity, give a hand up, not a hand out. God will provide the strength needed to bring about our restoration of those things that we're afraid of. The hand is offered, and our role is to grab it. And when we respond, then help and aid comes. But until we know we can't do it all ourselves, we're never going to grab the hand. Now, God says that he will strengthen us with his own righteous right hand. And I think it's cool that for sure during the time of Yeshua, this was the righteous right hand was a reference to Messiah. It's a prophetic title of the one who sits at the Lord's right hand. And that's from Psalm 110:1 that says of Messiah, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So what we're seeing in Isaiah 41:10, and it also goes on through verse 14, is that God promises to support his people with Messiah while he crushes their enemies. Now, I want you to look for God's right hand of support in your life. And I want you to make this lesson practical. Okay? So, are you ready? Okay, I want to give you a way for you to look for God's right hand in your life. Okay? I want you to think about your destructions, your exiles, when your enemies are pounding at the gates. And enemies can be the character flaws that you have that you're wanting to get over. So let me read Isaiah 41:10 again, and this time I want you to see it through the eyes of your own circumstances, your own devastations, your own ruins. Okay? Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not look around, for I am your Elohim. I shall fortify you, I shall help you, I shall uphold you with the right hand of my righteousness. Okay, so you can do this as a journaling exercise, all right, either in a journal or a piece of paper. First thing to notice, do not fear. So what I want you to do is spend some time prayerfully noticing your fears. Become aware of what they are. That may be easier said than done. That may take a process right there. You want to call them out, you want to name them. And then you want to write them down on one side of your notebook, like a column, list them, right? And then you're going to write something on the other side of the column. Once you have those written down, then you can focus on the next section, which is where God says, I am with you. And here you're going to compare the fears that you wrote down with the sovereignty of God. Now, how do you do that? Well, you're going to write down in a column next to your fears all the things that you know about God's goodness, about His sovereignty, about His might, His deeds. And I want you to keep writing until the things about God have overtaken the fears. So if you have 10 fears listed, and you don't have to have that many. You can do this exercise with one fear at a time, 2 fears at a time. But I want you to write down at least 1 or 2 more of God's character qualities, more than the fears that you have. Okay? And then when you do that, I want you to notice that you could have continued writing down God's good character qualities if I had not told you to stop. And then I want you to compare the list, the 2 lists. Okay? Who wins? The next thing I want you to do is you'll start 2 new columns. And you'll take a look at the phrase, do not be, or the command maybe, the empowerment, do not anxiously look about you. So on one side, I want you to write down your behaviors that stem from the fears that you wrote in that very first column. Okay? Because our behaviors stem from fears. So you write those down. And again, you can list a bunch or you can just list a couple at a time to do this exercise. The next section of our verse, I will strengthen you. So in this column, next to those items that you just wrote down, the ones about your behaviors that stem from fear, I want you to write a repeated statement. Something along the lines of, I'm not expected to take care of this on my own. I need God. So for every behavior that you wrote in one column, you put that statement in the other column. Okay? Now, when this idea came to me, I was suddenly transported to my 6th grade class where I was called up to the chalkboard and I had to write 30 times, I will not talk in class, I will not talk in class. Anyway. The next section that you'll focus on is where God says, surely I will help you. So underneath those 2 columns that you just did, this one won't be a column. This is going to be just a straight prayer that you're going to write out to God to ask Him to help you with your fears and your behaviors. Set your intention to overcome those things with God's help. Ask Him what He wants you to do. Okay? Ask Him, what does taking your right hand look like for me in this circumstance, in this situation? Now, this step may take a little while to formulate this prayer and to get a sense of what your action step would be, right? And then underneath that prayer, write praises to Yeshua for being that right hand of righteousness. Write out praises of gratitude for Him crushing whatever enemies, whatever fears. So fears are your enemies. whatever enemies that you had. Now, I don't know if this process will take um, an hour, a few minutes, several days, a week. I don't know. I'm going to do this too, and I will let you know how it goes, and I really hope that you would let me know how this goes for you too. Who is like our God? I'll see you next time in our next Haftarah lesson.